Whilst the bond was in construction, Melbourne City Council were conceiving a project called CH2. And their brief was to radically reinvent the perception of a building's responsibility to the city and society. They wanted to do it in such a way that they left a lot of legacies and a lot of demonstrations, and they even challenged the way the design team was put together. When we were invited to join the team, we were told that whilst they thought we would be the right people to do the job, they weren't convinced. We'd have to participate in an open-ended design charrette in Melbourne, at least 2 weeks, maybe running for 3 months, until we'd nailed most of the problems. They spent $175,000 on that process and probably saved themselves about $500,000 in the long term. A building which is so dependent on leading-edge innovations was delivered in less time than a conventional office. There were some immovables. It wasn't all easy. The building had a fixed budget and a fixed date. It was politically driven. There's a mayoral election, and those two things couldn't slip. One of the most sensitive things was how much we spend on buildings. This is a public authority. They're answerable to the ratepayers and the public stakeholders. And the money for this building came from an investment fund, which they'd got from selling one of the utilities a few years earlier. The investment fund had a minimum financial yield of 8.5%, otherwise they could not spend the money. So we helped them with a business case. They gave us access to all their employment data, all their absenteeism, all their staff churn rates, all their cost of training, and we extrapolated what the productivity benefits of moving their staff into a green building would be. We bookended conservative and optimistic. They settled on a 4.8% improvement in productivity year on year for 20 years, and they capitalised that financial benefit from the council into the building cost, which allowed them to spend on innovation about an extra $25 million. CH2 is now occupied, and it's given Melbourne City Council the visibility they need. When we talk about return on investments, one of the most powerful ones is John Soe, Lord Mayor of Melbourne, subsequently got voted World Lord Mayor of the Year. Independent post-occupancy studies have been undertaken, and the final productivity increase is estimated to be 10.8%, way above the 4.8% we based the business case on. Melbourne City Council value added $2.4 million per annum, or $270 per metre squared per annum for the 9,000 square metre building. That's almost as much as the entire rent they pay. A lot of value unlocked. And again, the building's been closely monitored, and the failures will be pointed out as well as the successes. One of the other interesting things that Melbourne City Council did was share all the IP on the project. So every single report which is authored is freely available to everyone in the industry to learn from, and there's a lot of them. So those two buildings were also used to calibrate Green Star. They showed the market that Green Star actually had the right language and it wasn't a greenwash scheme. Melbourne City Council got 6 Green Star, 30 of the bond got 5 as built. So a couple of years ago we had Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth, we had the IPCC report, we had the Stern report from the UK, and whilst our government stuck its head in the sand and denied the science, our boardrooms listened. They had the tools, they had an industry body which supported them, they set their own agenda for achieving leadership and tackling sustainability from a corporate perspective. And the result is even the most sceptical professions, and I'm talking about cost planners and valuers, are now suggesting that green buildings are really responsible for a 5 to 10% rise in rental prices in Australia. That 5 to 10% rise in rental prices translates to 5 to 10% rise in asset valuations, which leads to projections of very rapid obsolescence for the old 80s stock, which were in my first slide of the Sydney skyline. So I think the next example of Australian leadership will be the refurbishment and the rehabilitation of all those old buildings which are reaching the end of their useful life. So back to our perceived biggest threat. In November 2007, Kevin Rudd got elected as our new Prime Minister. He's a very articulate guy. I'm sure he's very well-meaning. His very first act on being sworn in after he became Prime Minister was to sign the Kyoto Protocol, to show his intent with respect to the environment. That left the US as the only red country on this map. Australia used to join them, the US is on their own now. So we believe that Rudd is looking for a leadership position on a global scale. One of his first acts was commission a report called the Garnaut Report. The Garnaut report is based very closely on the Stern report. In the preliminary findings to Cabinet, he's already suggested the Stern report was far too conservative and the urgencies much greater than Stern actually picked. We also have a local cost curve for green buildings. And I don't know if you've seen these curves before, but the stuff below the line is the stuff which is financially attractive, and the stuff towards the right above the line is very uneconomic and the things you do as a last resort to reduce carbon emissions. All the building-related activities, like air conditioning, are very much at the far left and lower part of the graph. Our government is not going to ignore the building sector, unfortunately. So I won't speak in detail to these either, but all these government initiatives we've had to respond to in the last 2 months alone. Mandatory disclosure for buildings, national greenhouse and energy reporting frameworks, and emissions trading scheme. What's happening is companies like my own and Maria's are having to devote our efforts to defend the freedom we have to innovate. And that's effort which would normally be spent doing good work in the industry. So the Green Building Council is also aware of its obligation to members. And one of the threats we see is not so much the regulatory mechanisms, but the burden of compliance, the cost of using all these different assessment tools. I'm not going to talk to this graph in detail, but essentially the Green Building Council is trying to produce carbon tools and water tools which can be used for both design, planning, mandatory disclosure, emissions trading theme, the same tools for all parts. So I'll leave you with this last slide. And it's kind of ironic because this was one of the first slides the Green Building Council produced in 2002. What it shows is what we thought the relationship should be with rewarding leadership in the marketplace versus the government's obligation to take a stick to the laggards, the people who would otherwise break the law. So if the UK can learn one thing from the Australian example, it's that legislation should be providing floors and not ceilings. Too much legislation will dull opportunity and take the opportunities away from our most innovative companies. And we all know the best people to solve this problem are within business and not within government. Thank you.